Funny, I thought you were above this. Then he slid the promotion letter across my desk with someone else's signature. I smiled low and cold. When the promotion stuck, I would make sure the lie cut deeper than their smiles. I remember the exact weight of that envelope. Cheap stock, glossy seal, the kind they use when they want something to look important without paying for it. Marcus leaned on my desk like he owned the wood, like every corner of this building belonged to him. That was the whole problem. Marcus had the posture of a man who'd learned early that pretending mattered more than doing. He'd taken my morning pieces, polished them, and reframed them for the board until the board loved him. Then he signed the promotion letter for Sam Ryland, who'd never met my drafts except in the feed where he'd copied them word for word and smiled for a camera. People think professional humiliation is loud, a public firing, a shouted accusation. Mine was quieter, a paper knife pressed into the soft part of my career. The promotion announcement went out as a cheerful, Adobe-smoothed email. Please congratulate Sam Ryland. The comments filled with heart emojis. My inbox filled with polite condolences and recycled HR platitudes. My fiancé left a voicemail I didn't listen to until later, because for a week the office was the only place that felt like a thing I knew how to do. I didn't shout. I didn't go to HR and scream. I sat down, closed the blinds in my tiny apartment, and did the thing that would be the only fair answer I could imagine. I re-archived. I dug into my old drives, pulled up backup folders with names like Drafts March 2019 V3 Final Revised, opened time-stamped files, and stared at metadata until it felt like reading a confession. There were 100 small things that proved authorship. A phrase dated 2 days before a published post, a tracked change saved under a throwaway username, an email where I sent a piece to a freelance fact-checker who'd replied with a single-sentence note. Those replies mattered. The first week was mostly collecting. I met with freelance contributors I'd ghosted for being too busy with deadlines. I suddenly had plenty of time to revisit. I apologized. I bought coffee. I was careful not to sound like a man looking for revenge. I wanted them as witnesses, not as actors in a melodrama. I asked for copies of timestamps, invoices, an old Google Doc where someone had left a comment in the kind of shorthand only inside collaborators used. D, can you clarify the stat here? That comment was mine. I kept my face calm at work. Marcus still strutted. Sam still posted tasteful photos and wrote piece headlines that were mine. They had the glamour, lunches with PR, late-night studio pods where they recorded insights they read off my paragraphs. What they didn't have was provenance. My re-archive was boring. It smelled of stale coffee and server logs. But it was solid. By the third week, I had a folder labeled Evidence and a spreadsheet with 2 columns. Document, proof. Each line was concise. File name, save 2019, 3/15, 02/12 UTC. Email to Leah, 2019, 03/15, 02/14. Google Doc comment. D, can you clarify the stat? 2019, 3/14, 21/03. It sounds petty to list the time a comment was left, but in our business, timing is everything. Someone had to triangulate the origin of ideas. If I couldn't make the dates speak, the story would be a he said, she said in a closed room. I also started leaving small, precise corrections in the comments section of the site. Not accusations, corrections. Footnotes that pointed to the primary source. A clarification here, a necessary comma there. People think undermining someone's it's them work means yelling. It doesn't. It means letting small errors multiply until readers notice the pattern of sloppiness. It means exposing the seams in a suit someone else is wearing. At home, the silence grew. My fiancé emailed to ask if I wanted to talk. I typed back and then deleted it. There are things that feel like cliffs. You can see the drop, you can name it, but you keep rearranging your life on the edge because stepping back means admitting the fall. The job had been everything we'd planned around. Moves, rent, wedding conversations tucked into the margins of article outlines. Losing credit was like losing the foundation of a house. You can live through it for a while, but every settled piece is a risk. I kept working though. Re-archiving is a discipline. It teaches you patience and how to make time into evidence. I found a draft where I'd written an aside about a nameless official that later appeared as Sam's crisp anecdote. I found a note to an editor where I'd pushed for a phrasing that later showed up in the headline. Every small coincidence felt like a map toward reclaiming the territory of my own voice. The people I reached out to mattered. There was Leah, who had fact-checked my 20,000-word profile, and who still had an email dated 6 months before Sam's piece that said, "Got your notes. Brilliant angle." There was Jorge, a photographer who had a raw folder of images with file names that matched the dates I'd asked him to shoot. No one wanted trouble, but most didn't want to be part of an untruth either. I offered anonymity. I offered to pay for their time. I offered nothing more dramatic than the truth presented plainly. I learned how small our industry could feel when you started tracing lines back. A lot of people had seen the drafts, skimmed them, forwarded them, or used them as a prompt. Not all of them were malicious. Few of them would admit complicity. But the pattern was there. Sam's rise was less creative genius and more practiced mimicry, a constant harvesting of other people's labor, stitched together with charm. And so I kept building the folder until there was no more room to doubt. Then I started to plan the second phase. Undermining credibility is an art of patience. You don't light a match and hope the whole thing burns. You smother the oxygen, you loosen the mortar between bricks, you let the structure show its cracks. I wrote corrections, careful, public, and unglamorous. I didn't accuse Sam by name. I didn't need to. I pointed readers to the original source material, formatted citations cleanly, and left breadcrumbs that any competent editor should have noticed. I pitched small pieces that would highlight editorial failures without seeming personal. One went to a trade journal, a methodical piece about the rise of embedded authorship, how content factories promote voices that are actually the product of many invisible hands. I framed it as a wider industry trend, and I used anonymized examples drawn from my evidence to illustrate the mechanisms. The editors accepted it without wanting a scandal. They wanted a thoughtful piece. I gave them one. People read that piece. It didn't have an immediate cinematic effect, but it seeded the idea that not all bylines are what they seem. An ethics committee at a rival outlet asked for a talk. A podcaster referenced my piece in an episode about credit in media. The point was not to shout fraud into the room. It was to make a set of quiet, reputable people ask a question about practice. Once professionals start asking, the defenses go up and the defensiveness shows. I also started to feed small inaccuracies to a few trusted contacts who still believed in the old rules. I would anonymously draw attention to a line in one of Sam's pieces and ask, "Curious, where did this stat come from?" Or I'd send a clean, sourced document with a headline, "If anyone needs the original doc for the Ryland piece." I never said Daniel or me. I made the documents themselves do the talking. People on the inside handle things differently when the evidence is tidy and the tone is professional. At work, I kept my face steady. Marcus noticed the corrections in the public comments and suggested a meeting. He wore his manager suit and the tone of someone who had forgotten the last time he earned anything. "We're fine," he said. "Perception is everything. Sam is a star." I asked a question about process instead of making an accusation. He bristled like a man with something to hide. "It's funny. People reveal more when you pretend you only want a policy update." I started to ask the formal questions in places where they had to be answered. The editorial standards committee, a reviewer group, the board's outside counsel. I framed everything as a concern for the industry, not a vendetta. That kept the lawyers on their toes. Lawyers love documentation. I gave them documentation. I gave them a timeline that the board couldn't ignore. Drafts, emails, timestamps, correspondences with freelancers. My spreadsheet was now a map that traced a theft pattern back 3 years. Meanwhile, Sam's profile only grew. He'd begun showing up on panels, arriving in that clean, effortless way people learn when they know PR will handle the tough stuff. But he also started slipping. Small things began to look staged. The offhand anecdote repeated word for word by someone else who'd tweeted it months prior. A fact-check request that he didn't respond to, but whose correction later appeared in his own feed. People noticed. Not enough to ruin him, but enough to pry at the veneer. I could have gone louder. Many in my position might have hired a publicist and created a spectacle. I wanted something different, to make sure the record was right and that the industry couldn't easily paper over the theft with another shiny award. So I played the long game. I curated where the evidence would land and how it would be framed, in reputable journals, in ethics discussions, and in places where the next step, legal scrutiny, could not be entirely avoided. There were personal costs. I stopped answering dinner calls. My fiancée began to leave notes on the fridge. Call me when you can. I left one night to meet a former editor who had been pushed out years before. He gave me names and dates in return for 2 beers. He had the kind of memory that confuses vengeance and justice. He told me, if you expose this, you won't like what comes next. He was right. Exposing a fraud rarely leaves everyone intact. It changes relationships, opens old wounds, and sometimes makes scapegoats of the wrong people. But there is a certain moral arithmetic to it. If you let a lie stand because it saves you personal discomfort, you live in a house of mirrors forever. I didn't want that. Then the award season came up. The industry journal announced nominations for Feature of the Year. Sam's byline was on a piece that had been well received. The magazine's PR people asked for a headshot for the nominee page. I watched the nomination with a detachment that surprised me. Winning wouldn't restore the past, but losing while the lie stood felt intolerable. If something could be done, the awards calendar provided a stage where scrutiny would be natural. I purified the dossier. I printed a clean package, original drafts with metadata, emails from freelancers, a chronology, a short explanatory note. I didn't send it to gossip columns. I sent it to people who would treat it like the professional complaint it was. The awards editorial board, a respected industry ombudsman, and a senior editor at a rival publication known for rigorous standards. I also uploaded material to a secure cloud with access logs, because sometimes the best way to present evidence is to let it be observed in a place that records who looks and when. By the time the awards jury convened, small, reputable inquiries had begun. The ethics board emailed with questions. Marcus called me in, not with a threat, but with a practiced apology that tastes like corrosion. "We need to be careful," he said. "Accusations can ruin people." I agreed, because I knew the evidence couldn't be reduced to feelings. It was data, and we were about to let the data speak. The awards night was a theater of good manners. The ballroom shimmered with rented confidence. People dressed in suits like armor and like apologies. Marcus moved through the room, smiling with the same expression he'd used when sliding that envelope across my desk. Sam stood under the softer lights, laughing with a publicist who smelled of citrus and narrative control. I was not there to shout. I didn't want drama. I wanted truth. But truth in our line of work sometimes still needs a mic and an audience to matter. I had one ally in the room who didn't know the whole story, a senior columnist who'd read my industry piece and seen the pattern. I had briefed him with parts of the dossier, given him access to the cloud documents. He didn't want to be dramatic either. He wanted to ask a simple public question if the panel discussion turned to authorship. We had a plan. If Sam accepted the award, the journal would print a short piece from the nominees with excerpts. The journal's editor had access to my dossier privately. I trusted the process to do the rest. When they announced the nominees, the room applauded politely. My hands felt cool around the program. Marcus mouthed something like, "This will blow over," and smiled. Sam took the stage when his name was called for Feature of the Year. His speech was practiced, a neat little orbit of humility and cleverness. He began, and the camera framed him like a confession. That was when the journal's editor did something they'd been hesitant to do in public. He said, "We need to address a question that's come to our attention about authorship and attribution in journalism today. Silence has weight. It collects embarrassment like dust." The editor spoke with the tone of someone who had read too many complicated emails. He described an internal review, anomalies in authorship patterns, overlapping drafts, and correspondence between a nominee and external contributors. He didn't name me. He didn't yet name Sam. He asked for patience. He promised a follow-up. That was the signal. My ally, the columnist, stood and asked a quiet, pointed question about whether the hallmarks of collaborative authorship had been adequately disclosed. It was small, surgical. Then in the printed program handed to the press later that night, the journal published a sidebar, an excerpt from a draft, with the original timestamps, and a note. Document provided by an independent source for verification. The applause in the room hung like a sound with a missing beat. People who thought they knew the story glanced at one another. Sam's smile stuttered. Marcus's jaw tightened. The editor's assistant, who had the new access logs on her tablet, leaned toward the editor and whispered. He read something, then folded his page, his face a map of decisions being made in real time. 2 days later, the industry journal published a fuller follow-up online, an article that walked through the timeline, presented redacted emails, and printed dated drafts where phrases later attributed to Sam were clearly present in earlier documents, bearing my name and timestamps. They included a screenshot of a Google Doc with comments from my collaborators asking clarifying questions months before Sam's piece ran. The piece was careful and cold and devastating because it didn't sensationalize, it simply showed provenance. The reaction was a sequence of small avalanches. Sam's PR scrambled, Sam's feeds went quiet. Marcus called for an internal review, legal counsel advised silence. The awards committee put the nomination on hold pending an investigation. Conversations that had been private began appearing in public feeds. Editors who'd turned a blind eye now needed to answer where they'd landed. Sam's reaction, when it came, was not a denial but a slow, uneasy shifting of responsibility. He said he'd relied on a team and on brainstorming sessions and contributions that blurred lines. That argument carries weight when the industry tolerates aggregation and ghosting. It carries less when you have dated drafts and emails that match phrasing minute for minute. The distinction is legal and moral. Sam had built his voice from notes that were not credited to him. He had built a career on curation as if it were creation. There were personal moments that cut deeper. Leah, who had been hesitant to speak at first, gave a written statement. She had fact-checked and annotated my draft and had sent it back with a line. "Love the voice on this, D." Abruptly, colleagues who'd taken my work for granted began to say that they had their doubts all along. People who had been friends in seedy conference bars now pretended to de-identify from the problem. You'll find out who your allies are when the public record requires them to choose between convenience and truth. The formal outcome came in the way institutions make outcomes. Hearings, internal memos, a quiet meeting with HR. Sam was put on leave pending investigation. Marcus was moved to a consulting role, pending evaluation. The awards committee rescinded the nomination and issued an apology that read like a contract clause. Sam's pieces were appended with notes about authorship and in some cases retracted. The industry journal published its final report with footnotes and annexes that made the theft irrefutable to anyone who read them. When the public finally had enough to decide, the backlash focused on Sam. The word imposter appeared in headlines. Colleagues who'd previously defended him shifted language from creative to misattribution. His email went unanswered. The talent agent who'd been quietly shopping him to other outlets told a mutual acquaintance that they were taking a pause. People prefer to be associated with winners. They are even more eager to unassociate from scandal. I did not feel triumphant. I felt tired and oddly bereft. The office where I'd spent years felt unfamiliar. People who had been present when I wrote jokes about wire transfers and municipal budgets now considered me, in small acts of discretion, an inconvenient truth. Some reached out privately to apologize. A few more publicly thanked me for raising standards, which is a polite way of saying they appreciated the result without remembering the friendship. The consequences were complicated. Sam lost his position. Several publications blacklisted his name for a time. Marcus lost the immediate trappings of power. The legal department opened a civil inquiry about misattribution and unpaid freelance contributions. My dossier was cited in a way that made my name visible again. A rival publication offered me a job with a small team and a promise of editorial independence. I accepted because independence is rare and because the world is more bearable when you can earn again under your own byline. But justice, even when it arrives, is an odd creature. It doesn't bring back time. It doesn't fix the apartment where you argued over whose career would be the anchor. It doesn't replace the quiet mornings that my fiancé had drifted through alone. It gives you a cleaned record and opens a new ledger where you can try to be honest about what you will and will not accept. In private, I found myself rereading an old draft and feeling like I'd been reading someone else's handwriting. Reclaiming a voice is partly about proving you wrote it and partly about deciding what you will write next. The public part was done. The private part, choosing what that voice would become, was only beginning. The new job was quieter in many ways. It was also smaller, which meant that every byline mattered in a way that felt closer to work than theater. My editor there, a woman with a habit of underlining sentences in red ink, was blunt about the cost of what I'd done. You cleaned the record, you also made enemies. Don't expect invitations to the usual places for a while. She was right. I stopped getting calls for panels. People who used to invite me to late-night drinks suddenly had excuses. The industry is a network. Do wrong to the network, and the network tightens like a bruise. Friends' relationships shifted. My fiancé and I tried to talk about the future, but grief had a way of coloring decisions. She had to rebuild trust in the sense that our plan had been broken, not just by one stolen byline, but by the slow erosion of the belief that merit would be recognized without me having to fight like an animal to prove it. We argued less about the news and more about practicalities, whether to accept moving for the new job, whether to postpone the wedding. Those are the dull, important things that revenge doesn't mend. There were moments of unexpected kindness. Jorge, the photographer, sent me a raw folder with a single note. Use these however you want. Leah sent a short email. You did the right thing. Those lines are small salves. They remind you that, in the end, work isn't only the currency, it's also proof you existed in a particular way. The legal inquiries dragged on, as legal things do. Freelancers who had never been paid by Sam's production sought modest settlements. A few editors who'd ignored attribution quietly amended their byline policies. There was a public conversation about what constitutes authorship and a modest industry shift toward better documentation. That felt like a win, even if the change was slow. I learned to be cautious about celebration. Too much celebration feels like performance, and I'd grown wary of performing. The thrill of seeing my name back where it belonged was real, but it was also tangled with loss. A mentor told me once that the truest measure of a career is not the applause, but the quiet accumulation of work that you can point to and say, this is mine. That felt like the right metric to hold now. I also learned to be precise about forgiveness. Not everybody deserved it. Some colleagues had known and done nothing. Others had been complicit out of their own fear. I forgave the ones who seemed genuinely surprised or ashamed. I did not forgive the ones who had used me as a stepping stone and then smiled like nothing had happened. Forgiveness isn't a moral abdication. It's a choice you make to keep your energy for the things that matter. Months passed. Sam resurfaced with a long, defensive essay about collaboration and the changing nature of journalism. It read like a plea, but it lacked the accountability that would make it redeemable. People read it and nodded and then moved on. My name continued to appear on pieces that mattered. The new job gave me a team that respected attributions and kept logs with the kind of meticulousness I had once used to prove a point. That respect is, in its smallest form, a kind of repair. The final cost arrived in private. My fiancée left. It wasn't a dramatic breakup. It was a series of small absences and silences that knitted into a conclusion. She said she felt like she had been standing next to someone who had been misrepresented, and then she had to live with the consequences. I don't blame her. You build a life on mutual progress, and when one person becomes a public battleground, the shared map changes. I grieved not only the relationship, but the version of myself who had thought love and work could be corralled into the same neat life. The thing about professional revenge is that it's often less cinematic than it is quiet and administrative. It trades spectacle for evidence. It trades revenge for restoration. I didn't humiliate anyone on stage or break things in a blaze of righteous fury. I compiled documents. I let the facts do the damage. That felt like both the best and the loneliest way to be vindicated. Years later, I sit at a desk that feels less like a battlefield and more like a workshop. I write with the care of someone who knows the cost of words and the debt of authorship. I mentor young writers on documentation and ethics. I tell them quietly that the thing to be careful of is not only the theft of your work, but the small compromises you make so you can keep your seat at the table. Sometimes keeping the seat means losing the house. If there's a moral, it's this. Reputation is a ledger, and ledgers can be rewritten. But the only real defense is the slow, patient accumulation of proof that you existed before the applause. People will misread that as bitterness. Mostly it's just a stubborn way to keep the facts on your side. I still keep the printed envelopes in a drawer, the cheap stationery that started the whole thing. Sometimes I open one and look at it the way you look at an old scar. It doesn't hurt anymore. It remembers.